I am thrilled that we get to talk about cybersecurity. It's obviously very much in the news. It's obviously a topic of great urgency. And I think as the old adage is, these days, you're either being hacked or you just don't know that you're being hacked. Japan, doubling of its defense budget, multidimensional warfare situations. Again, cybersecurity is right at the forefront. Now, we couldn't be in a better position than Cartan. Cartan has been in Japan for 30 years this September. Yeah. And has a wealth of experience, first in financial technology, and then, increasingly in cybersecurity. He's got deep connections across the entire range of the Japanese public and private sector. And I want to open the floor to Cartan. He will give a presentation, and then we'll have a bit of a fireside chat, and then we'll move to Q&A from the audience. So, Cartan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. So, I've got lots of slides, but I'll skip through them quite quickly. I created Nihon Cyber Defense after planning it 2015, 2016, and then incorporating it in 2017. And I've been very lucky in establishing a team of people, such as General Iwasaki, the former chief of the defense staff, and a group of gentlemen that all had backgrounds both in cyber and security, and of course, as part of what I call either UK or US IC, or which is the intelligence community. We've a broad range of people pulled from Japan, the United States, the UK. Admiral Lee is the former chief of the defense staff in Taiwan. And people ask me, well, Cartan, why did you bring such a team of people together, including members of industry such as Aoki-san, who's the president of K-Line, Kodama-san's the former chairman of Barclays in Japan. Well, cyber is a problem that shouldn't be left to the intelligence community or the IT community. It has a direct impact and effect in the society and the lives we lead today. So I felt, and I'll go back to why I picked the majority of my team is from the UK. I believe that the UK is number one in terms of protection of public-private sector. The United States is very strong in the offensive cyber capabilities and in the intelligence part, but the UK protects its society very well. Why does the UK protect its society very well? Well, Gordon Brown, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, went on a fact-find mission to China. And whatever happened to him on that trip, he arrived back in the UK and he went straight into the Prime Minister and said, I need at least £1 billion. And that was the formation of what became the National Cybersecurity Centre. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened here, and we are behind the curve in Japan. For many years, Japan had this cyber isolationism, as I would call it, the feeling that once again there's an ocean that surrounds the country, so we're okay. But obviously underwater cables would defeat that isolationism. We saw changes coming with the Olympics. Unfortunately, the Olympics didn't happen due to COVID to the extent that we saw. So there weren't the level of cyber attacks that we would have seen even in London in 2012. So it raised awareness in cyber, but it didn't quite press the button. There have been major cyber attacks, and one would only have to look at Fujitsu recently and what's happening there, and the MSPs getting hit more and more and more. So there are some wake-up calls. There is obviously this fear of China and Russia, but people don't really, society doesn't really understand what that means. We now have the Ukraine risks, but I think, and I do believe that the one event that will probably lead to a massive wake-up call on cybersecurity in this country is what I call the Taiwan escalation. We will already see new groups being formed by the PLA in southern China, whose sole purpose will be the targeting of Japan and its infrastructure. And people say, well, why is that? Japan is obviously a high-value target militarily, economically, and often in terms of IP theft, technologically as well. I believe it's number one in Asia, but I do believe, and I still believe today, that it's at least 5 to 10 years behind the United States and the UK in cybersecurity. METI, I say a recent study, but it's quite an old study now, 4 years old, and METI analysed the shortage of engineers and come up with a number around 200,000 or 250,000 security professionals. It's probably closer to 500,000. You know, and then we see in the press at the minute all of these articles that say, oh well, we're going to our defence budget's going to double. You know, we're going to take our cyber team from 500 to 2,000. Well, where's the extra 1,500 people going to come from? Because I certainly can't find them, and I'm going to pay a lot more than Boe's show is going to pay for people. And you will find people like Nawa-san, who's Toshio Nawa is part of my team. Most of the key cyber people in this country today are volunteers within the government. Much, and you know, and it's going to be the biggest hurdle for Japan in the future. Is where are we going to find those folks? So this is the statistics that released recently about the number of cyber cases. I do believe this is nonsense. I believe that the number could be 3, 4, 5 times higher than that. There is this, and you will talk to industry in Japan about ransomware, for example, and you'll ask someone, say, well, no, we won't pay. We definitely won't pay. But the number of ransomware payments that have been paid privately and quietly are going like that. The ransomware groups have now realised that Japan is not just a vulnerable place, but a place where payments are made too easily. And the Australians would be blaming Japan currently for a rise in ransomware across the APAC region, given the tendency to make ransomware payments. You know, I try many times to highlight to society in Japan, well, what is it, or what makes Japan such a target? Well, Japan, and given its relationship with the United States and the Western countries, and that those binoculars at the bottom represent Five Eyes as like a protective umbrella for the Asia Pacific Rim. You know, we've got, you know, the Russians in the north, the North Koreans in the middle, and China in the south. So it's unfortunately sitting slap bang in an area of intense interest for those countries. And the motivations, of course, are different for each of these sides. So there's how China, Russia, and North Korea view Japan. You know, there's a Japanese general that often will come up with his presentations. He shows a map and turns it upside down and talks about it. But he is right. That is how they view it. And were Japan to be completely vulnerable, for example, for the United States, then the next stop is Hawaii, and then the west coast of the United States. So therefore, and I don't want to talk too much about the military side of things, but you know, given the presence that the United States has here, it attracts the PLA massively to infiltrate Japanese infrastructure, cyber or otherwise. Number of personnel. So this is these are conservative estimates, but I would think that China, and it's on the rise as well, would have somewhere around in the region of 100,000 personnel dedicated to cyber. Russia around 60,000. North Korea 20,000. Japan's a very difficult number to come up with because all of the ministries in Japan are so siloed that I couldn't come up with a number to say what it is. But I will say one thing. For example, Signals Intelligence in the UK, which is GCHQ, our government communications headquarters, I think there's about 12,000 people in Cheltenham. You know, and that's aside from the intelligence world of MI5, MI6, and then what exists in the National Cybersecurity Centre as well. So Japan has to start thinking of a model like that, and I often refer to it and ask the question, well, what size do they need? Well, I always use, I don't know if I'm right or wrong on this when I say this, is that, well, the UK is half the size of Japan. The UK is half the size of Japan, and Japan is half the size of the United States. And look at the infrastructure that both of those countries have built for themselves in the world of cyber intelligence and defensive things. You know, the geopolitical landscape, it's just, you know, unfortunately, it's not getting any better with the invasion of Ukraine, what's happening in China, Xi going for another term, Taiwan, and of which I spend a lot of time in Taiwan with the Taiwanese. And an interesting fact is, like I say, when they talk about the community or the population of Taiwan, well, what's the problem there? So it's often explained to me, well, the older generation obviously see themselves as having a relationship with China, or indeed having been past Chinese people. The younger generation in Taiwan, of course, see themselves only as being Taiwanese. But the problem in mainland China is that every child is educated at school, that that island belongs to them and all the people on that island are Chinese. So will independence be declared by Taiwan in the future? Well, certainly the younger generation would like to think so. And of course, that will create an escalation in tensions in that area. And sorry, I'm going very fast because I would like to get through to some things. So this geopolitical landscape just changes. And I think Taro also hit the nail on the head very well when he said, you know, future historians will say that the Reiwa era is the beginning of a new Cold War between the United States and China. But it's not just the United States. It's the world you will see against China. We see UK aircraft carrier groups in Japan these days, the Germans flying squadrons of fighter planes to Singapore and then to Japan to see if they could deploy aircraft here within 24 hours. Well, why are these things happening? Well, there's good reasons behind it all, but I'm not a politician, and I'm not in the military, so I'll let you read the papers on that side. One thing that did happen was at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin did release his hacking groups. There used to be some oversight by the FSB and Russian intelligence against the targets that were being hit by the Russians in terms of ransomware. But since the war with Ukraine has started, there is no oversight at all. It's basically unleash the dogs of war in the world of cyber. And they do punish. Make no mistake, the Chinese and the Russians and the North Koreans have very, very experienced offensive cyber teams. I put this picture, it just shows the relationship between the cyber groups in Russia and indeed the state. This is one of Russia's most famous hackers who decided to take his sports car and do donut driving around Red Square, and of course not arrested. Quite happy to let him go. You know, the policeman just telling him off. There's skid marks all over the centre of Red Square. You know, so that relationship. What can Japan do in cyber? Japan needs to strengthen its defences, and I think the second point is very important as well. It needs to develop its own technologies. 95% of the cyber technology in this country is imported. So if you're importing it, that means that your local workforce is not getting the skills around cyber security. I feel there has to be a change in the legislation side of offensive cyber, and maybe academia would not agree with me on that, but if it's not done, they'll fall victim to more of it because they can't respond. There's no defense without having some offensive capability as well. Cyber isn't a technical issue. Unfortunately, since the Nakano School closed in 1945, and then the American, basically Japanese intelligence was a very, very small component. So unlike the UK and the United States, who have massive capability in those areas, when those guys retire, they're leaving those institutions and they're going out and forming cybersecurity companies with all of that experience they've garnered as being members of the intelligence community. There isn't that cyber tradecraft in intelligence in Japan. There needs to be a national cyber program, and by national cyber program, I mean that everything from junior high schools right through to industry. You know, if you were to look at the UK, GCHQ run even girls' high schools cyber competitions to build that capability, to be able to analyse and find people and interest a younger generation in the world of cybersecurity. Last year, and I was extremely disappointed by this, we created an undergraduate cyber program that we designed ourselves, given the fact we had so much experience. And I was asked to do that for a Japanese university. And we spent a great deal of time, building it. But unfortunately, in the end, the lecturers felt that cyber was kind of a military kind of thing. And they just decided not to go with it. Japan needs to centralise its government ministries. Its cyber budget currently today is just chopped up among everybody. METI, MIC, NSS, everybody's got a bit of cyber, but there's no cyber czar. Now, I think NISC in July and August of this year, there might be some announcement around that. But certainly, it has to be a concentrated effort. There has to be a leader. There's someone that's driving this nationally, reporting into the Prime Minister on these kind of things. And again, we need to see some implementation of clearances and background checks in Japan. It's so easy to infiltrate government in Japan because of the lack of clearances and background checks. One only has to look at what the Russians did with the Cambridge 5 or what became the Cambridge 6. They were recruiting them in university, and it became obviously the biggest crisis for UK intelligence was World War II. Is that happening here? 1,000% sure that it's happening here. That insider threat is a massive problem. It's so much so that I was talking to Kadama-san and the other board members of NCD that I wanted to take one page in the Nikkei and say, here's a helpline number. If you have been what the word I'm looking for, if you've had a problem with China or Russia where you feel you're in a desperate situation and you were put under pressure to release any information, call this number and that we will deal or talk to you confidentiality about what your options are. I think it's a massive problem here. I think I think we'll see the odd thing like SoftBank there a couple of years ago, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. If anyone were to look at an aerial photograph of the Russian embassy close by here and see the size of that mission and the number of cars in the car park, all those people aren't punching visas. You can be sure of that. COVID, it just increased the landscape for cyber attacks. All these people working from home, it made it easier. you know, how many people, and even online or in this room today, if I were to go to their house and look at their router, their internet router, would I be able to find that the default password is the one that came off the box when they bought it out of Big Camera? Or indeed when it was installed by some internet service provider? Because 15 years ago, even the internet service providers, it was at your discretion whether you wanted to change that password or not. Very quickly, I think it's important to highlight the differences between the three most active nations dealing in Japan and what they're doing. So, you know, North Korea, I saw an article in the Nikkei there, you know, a month ago where they talked about the number of virtual currency exchanges that had been hacked by the North Koreans and how much they'd stolen. But even in 2019, when I was talking to the Japanese military, even in 2019, they'd stolen over $2 billion. And it didn't really sink in until I told them that, well, the $2 billion would have been enough to purchase 1,200 cruise missiles. Yep. You know, and that's what they're using them for. The North Koreans aren't buying Ferraris with their ill-gotten gains. They're buying weapons of mass destruction. China would be, I feel, the biggest threat to Japan over the next 10 to 20 years. The Russians, I think, will have some deal with them in the future. I know we've got all the problems and the war in Ukraine, but I think the Russians can be brought to the table. But the PLA are on a mission and increasing their capability in cyber every day. I was just skipping through this. You know, the motivations are changing all the time as well. And there's this blur between state and crime and the two working together. And in those three countries I just mentioned, you can be sure that the groups within those organisations are working both ends, both from a crime factor or a nation-state factor. And we'll see that escalation. And I hope you I'm out of time now, but remember what I'm going to say now. Over the next, there will be, I'm predicting an explosion of ransomware attacks against Japanese infrastructure, and intelligence coming out of places like Taiwan and other places that we have strong connections would indicate the formation of many new groups targeting this country. So I hope I'm wrong, but I do believe that we're going to have tough times ahead and that great changes need to be made in Japan to cope with the stress that will bring. There was an opportunity to learn from what happened in the UK and the United States to their infrastructure, but those lessons haven't been learned here, unfortunately. And it's going to take a WannaCry or NotPetya targeting Japan to really escalate things to a point where there's a real wake-up call.
Cartan, I don't know whether to thank you or, but of course I thank you, for this very sobering remark. But wow. So, in terms of, the priority, right? You mentioned a couple of things. And particularly I was interested in the lesson from the UK, where there really was this sense of crisis that actually led to action from the top down. In your experience, and you deal, with all the actors, all the decision makers involved there, what's lacking? Why is there no sense of urgency on the Japanese side?
So I think that we've seen there has been a lot more attacks than we've been alerted to. I think that the major Japanese defense contractors, there's been indications submarine plans stolen in these. I think there hasn't been enough exposure of the risk to society in Japan. There's been a lot of things hidden from us. And it's, as I said, it's very siloed. It's very siloed. If I were to ask the people in the room who in the government is responsible for cyber and who indeed would we go to, Is it NSS? Is it Ciro? Is it METI? Is it MIC? Who leads it? Who leads it? Is it the military? It's not. So I think that's an issue, and there is too much. There needs to be a cyber leader. A cyber leader.
Isn't that the police?
So the NPA, you have the prefectural side of things, and then you have the NPA, and then you have NISC sitting within NSS. Not really, no. And then in the UK, it's not the police either. So it's left with Signals Intelligence, or GCHQ, and NCSC, the National Cyber Security Centre, that coordinates all government effort on cyber. So Kieran Martin, who's part of NCD today, he was the first CEO of the National Cyber Security Centre, and that was the government realising, much to the angst of the different intelligence communities in the UK and the police and different government ministries, to say, right, make this work. This is it. We're doing this, and bring everybody together. And you guys, there's a CEO, there's Kieran Martin at the time, you're leading it. It's your job. Fix it.
Now, you mentioned the shortage, the METI estimate of shortage of engineers. Whatever the number is, 200,000 according to METI. You think it's closer to 500,000. Talk to us a little bit about. I mean, isn't cyber just a digital nomad, sort of writing the program and figuring things out, or how important? Where do you recruit your engineers, and how can Japan recruit its engineers?
So, unless there is an educational shift, and by that I mean starting to look at undergraduate programs on cybersecurity, there's always going to be a massive shortage here. If you look at the UK and the United States and other countries in Europe, the number of universities offering these programs, you can do a degree in the UK in ethical hacking. You could do a degree in the UK in forensics. You could do a degree in cyber. You could do a master's in cybersecurity as well. I don't know of one undergraduate cybersecurity program in Japan. Not one. So you've got it's at the grassroots level. They've got things for teenagers and junior high school, hack the box programs. All the high schools have been told. So here's a question: why is Israel so good on cybersecurity? Because everybody does national service, and the Israelis are able to look at the tests that they give those kids when they're doing their national service. Cyber. They're able to harvest a nation full of young cyber people. That's not happening here. Where do I get my people from? It's very, very difficult, I've even created sort of like. If you work for me for 3 years, after that, I'll pay for your cyber masters in the UK, and you can work from our offices in the UK, and these kind of things to try and attract those younger people. It's not really working, So if you saw those pictures, you see many grey-haired men, including myself, were in those photographs. I have started looking below the university level at trying to find young Japanese people, or indeed there's a community of very well educated Japanese females at the 30 to 45-year-old bracket that could also be trained in cyber. So I'll be. That's generally where I'm going to.
I mean, the reskilling is there. Now you mentioned, and if you could please elaborate, your sort of proposal to a Japanese university to sort of have a program tailor-made, and everything was progressing nicely, and then in the final steps, it was sort of a revolt by the other professors. Can you elaborate a little bit of that? Because there's obviously sort of with the doubling of the defense budget, that's fine, but there's a particular within academia, never mind general society, there's a big sort of allergy almost against anything that has to do military, anything that has to do defense. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so we were asked by the board of the university.
It's a private university.
Yeah. To create this program, I reached back. So there are university degree programs in the UK accredited by GCHQ, and I had been talking to several of those universities. 3 or 4 members of our team are visiting professors at Oxford and Cambridge and Imperial. So we did build a very, very nice program. But as soon as we delivered the program, and there was nothing in it that looked in any way like offensive cyber or hacking or anything. It was all defensive kind of cyber education. That well, do we want to have this? Do we want cyber? If we're teaching cyber, does it? It's hemmed and had, and then came back basically, and the message was no, they won't climb off that left leaning or side of things and look at this. It was a great pity.
So it's interesting. I mean, there's this whole mind shift, right? That obviously needs to be, sort of engineered. The whole, mindset, needs to change. Let me switch gears. China is sort of the obvious, it's obviously sort of on the forefront of cyber insecurity enforced onto other people. But there's about 65,000 Japanese companies who've got major business in the People's Republic of China. They've been around, right from the beginning for the last 30 years. Many of the companies deeply ingrained, within the People's Republic of China's, networks, and actually quite good at procuring even government contracts in many areas. So it's not as though as the private sector here in Japan is certainly not naive in its relations with the People's Republic of China and has never been naive about this. Talk to me a little bit about when you engage with private companies here in Japan, right? How they look at cybersecurity and, in particular, how they view sort of their interactions and their potential vulnerabilities from the density of relations with the People's Republic of China.
So, over the last 24 months, we get this more and more from Japanese corporations where we're brought in and asked. So, given what happened in Ukraine, we saw an exodus. If there were an escalation of events down in the Taiwan Strait, I think many Japanese corporations are looking at de-risking China, and by de-risking, they want to have plans or at least ideas in place of how they could extract themselves out of China, but in doing it in such a way that it would look like a restructuring of their business units so as not to infuriate or anger the Chinese. Mm-hmm. So we see a lot more of that. We get asked that a lot these days about how would you go about that, because obviously we're a cybersecurity company, but many of our team are former members of different government organisations that would understand how to carry out those kind of operations. You see now changes happening where this new anti-spying legislation or laws in China where they can basically walk into your office and lift the server out and have a look. Or indeed, there's some new policy coming where you have to buy that Chinese server and install it in your office if you want to operate in mainland China. And I find it incredible because, they're making it more and more difficult for any foreign company to do business in mainland China. Mm-hmm. What's the end game there, given that their country depends so heavily on the exports of goods to the rest of the world? So remember, you might think from my slides that I maybe sound anti-Chinese or something like that. There are 1.4 billion Chinese people, and they're great people, the Chinese. They are. You know, culturally, historically, they're wonderful people. But unfortunately, they've got 90 million Chinese Communist Party members who have a very, very different view of the world and a very, very different view of plan. And they're playing a long game with everyone. So it's very, very difficult, as you say, about those Japanese corporations that are obviously doing very well in mainland China. What do they do? And they look at what happened in the Ukraine and what happened there, and they're very worried about it. And so they should be, because how can you operate a business and where at any moment somebody walks in and just takes all your infrastructure or arrests, as we see these arrests happening, politically motivated, to say, oh no, actually, we think you're a spy, you're going to jail. You know, and how do you get anyone to want to go and work in mainland China, or indeed even in Hong Kong these days? Because someone asked me recently about moving to Hong Kong, and I said, well, you know, you've got teenage children. What if one of them in their classroom at their school in Hong Kong says, "I hate China"? You know, so these are risks that they need to think about, the Japanese corporations, about what does the future hold.
No, but bring that down to the sort of your specific area, you know, so, you know, companies like Toyota, you know, just not to single out Toyota, just it's always the company that springs to mind. You know, so you do have a dense relationship with the People's Republic of China, right? But it's specifically in terms of the risk of having been infiltrated already in the Japanese corporate, you know, networks, right? That there are already the Trojans, that there are already the bugs in there that could be activated. And compare that, if you may, you know, to, for example, British companies that do business in the People's Republic of China, or German companies that do business in the People's Republic of China, is their mode of defense, of actually knowing that they have been vulnerable to infiltration via their cyber networks.
So, yes, those what we refer to staging as the deployment of assets within an infrastructure to be used in the future should there be an escalation of tensions or for whatever reason. Yes, there are threat hunting programs and you could run, and you can have vulnerability assessments, maturity assessments, these kind of things. Are you going to find everything? No. And by the way, you can build as high a wall as you want, but if the PLA look to breach your network, there's a very good chance they will. One of the biggest problems that faces organizations is how to deal with it when it does happen. How to isolate networks, how to isolate parts of their infrastructure. Do they have an incident management plan? Do they, for example, in ransomware, do they have a ransomware policy? Are they going to pay a ransom or not? So we've got these, I don't have them today, but these slides we're talking to organisations. What does good look like? What does bad look like? Bad is about control. All about control. And in the event of a cyber attack, how do they control it? Because it's not an if scenario, it's just when for every organisation. And it's that the percentage of organisations getting hit in Japan is growing and growing. So remember another thing as well is given the Chinese community that exists globally, if any member of their family still resides in mainland China, it is very easy for them to become part of what's called a blended attack. A blended attack, it's people and technology. So you might build a very, very high wall, but you've got an employee who walks in the door with a USB stick and just sticks it straight into the network. How do you combat that? And that's things that organizations need to think about having a proper insider threat program, monitoring employees. For example, if they're entering the office at 3 a.m. on a Saturday night and staying a couple of hours, there are indicators of these things and systems that you could purchase to look at those kind of scenarios. But it's difficult. Right. It's not easy. You know, and there's a sort of like a traffic light. I like to think of it as like a traffic light. You know, red, orange, and green. any organization says they're green in terms of their cyber means that they are so risk averse that they'll never expand their business to do any business.
Oh, they use facts.
Yeah.
Right.
So basically, you should be in the orange. You should be in the orange layer, but unfortunately, most organisations are on the red layer, and I see horrific scenarios where I ask them, well, yeah, have you multi-factor authentication? Yes, we do. Okay, well, for everyone? No, the system administrators, because they're logging in and out so much, they don't have multi-factor authentication. I said, but, they're the guys with the most authority across your whole network. So and the patient zero scenarios that we see in many organizations, well, it's cyber hygiene, basic cyber hygiene as well. If you get the basics right, very, very often I will say to an organization, build your wall high enough that they move on to someone else. If you've built it high enough, then they'll look at that, that's going to take me 6 months. Let's go for someone else,
But your assessment definitely is that sort of on the global scale, compared to the Europeans, compared to the Americans, that the wall in Japan is relatively low.
Yeah,
the barrier to entry is.
So there are some organisations, the major Japanese banks have, and some of the major Japanese critical national infrastructure corporations have spent a lot and done a pretty good job there. But then if you look at the...
So my gas and electricity supply is safe?
Yeah, you're putting me on the spot.
No, right.
I think so. But if you look at the supply chain, and the manufacturing heartlands of Japan, it would be pretty weak in those areas. And, I was asked recently in a Japanese corporation, and they said to me, yeah, but we were told if we bought this system that there was 100% guarantee. And I said, really? Well, whoever told you that was lying to you. 100% guarantee, really? Of course, I want to buy that system for myself. Yeah, the heartland of manufacturing industry would be a big issue. I feel.
Right. I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. Robert, please.
Thank you very much, Robert Dujaric, Temple University, Japan. I have a question. There are two ways to conceptualize defending yourself against cyber threats, which are not incompatible. One is you build a defense. The other one is you build an offense and you create deterrence, which is what essentially, say, the U.S. chose about nuclear warfare. There's no... during the Cold War, the idea was, yes, the Soviets can attack us, but if they do, they're going to get hit again. How do you conceptualize this? In other words, should Japan invest a lot in offense to basically tell China, Russia, North Korea, look, if you cross certain red lines, we'll go after you? Or should it invest more in defense?
Well, both. The answer is both. And so offense is a dangerous word to use, because remember that most of the networks that are being used to come in to carry out these attacks are public sector or private sector company servers that they're using. So if somebody uses the server of a hospital in Singapore to stage an attack against Japan, in the wrong hands, if they attack back, they could bring down the network of that hospital. So a dangerous thing. But to have the capability to say, if you attack us, well, we could potentially attack your military infrastructure. I think Japan needs to invest in that side, but that would require a constitutional change. But yes, building the defences is one thing, but you have to have that capability, a cyber force that also has that offensive side. Without it, you're right, in the Cold War, it's that balancing act that you played, you attack us, we'll hit you back. That has to be done in cyber as well.
Thank you so much. It's a very nice topic to learn about the future of Japan. My question will be about faculty members in cyber security education. Many faculty in Japan try to stay away from national security or national defense. Suppose if we have a graduate program, 2 years for the cyber security in Japan, what kind of expected qualification we'll need for the faculty members? Should they come from the professional industry, or should we have somebody from a UK or US educated faculty members in cybersecurity? Thank you.
So my plan at the beginning was exactly that, was to use UK or US until this university could establish itself. But remember, Japan has some very good computer science departments, and the transition from computer science to cyber is not that difficult. That cyber tradecraft part, the ethical hacking bit, yes, you would need to bring people in from industry to help with that. For example, and we're a Japanese company, but we're members of it. In the UK, they have what's called the Industry 100, and it's part of the National Cybersecurity Centre, and large industries or industries that are strong in cyber commit a resource on a monthly basis to that Industry 100 programme, which then helps academia as well. And as I say, many members of Nihon Cyber Defense are visiting professors at different UK universities as well to help that. And you'll find that those former government people are very passionate about helping. Indeed, one of the reasons why that team, and we're a small company, but the big cyber players in the world are very jealous of me because I have that team, because those people don't want to work for big corporate, but they want to work for Nihon Cyber Defense because they believe that it's important to help Japan, and Japan needs help.
But I think it's interesting, the point, if I understand you correctly, I mean, it's not just about the engineering, right? It's the entire concept, right? And that goes into arguably the humanities, for example, as well, to at least create sort of a sense, not a sense of crisis, but a sense of awareness.
And a cultural change as well is required. For example, in a ransomware attack, I've been in Japan so long that my thinking is probably very Japanese. It's like in a ransomware attack, we led the incident management for probably Japan's biggest ransomware attack in corporate history last year. And I was watching the negotiation with the Russians lasted 6 weeks, and it was a very large amount of money that was being requested. But being here so long, culturally, in my heart, I found it very difficult to watch this negotiation in a very professional manner taking place, which was with criminals. I couldn't, and the people around me in Nihon Cyber Defense, my board and our ransomware negotiators were saying, Cartan, we did this every day when we were in government. We know what we're doing. It's because I couldn't deal with the fact that these are crooks on the other end of this. And that's a difficult thing for the Japanese to deal with, to understand that the person on the other end of the communication is a state-sponsored former FSB or GRU criminal, a criminal. And I do find that bit very difficult.
So given the situation that you've described, I would guess that there's a lot of diversity among the Japanese industry as to their capabilities on cybersecurity. And you mentioned, I think, that the financial sector may be a little bit more advanced than the manufacturing sector. But within the financial sector or within the manufacturing sector, can you give us some examples of companies that have been especially effective versus those have been especially ineffective? Or if you can't give us the names of companies, can you tell us the characteristics of those companies that are most effective and those that are least effective?
The most effective, they build security operation centres. In some of the big financial groups, they have people with the understanding of the tradecraft side of cybersecurity as well. They're not just investing in lots and lots of technology. They've some very skilled people. They're not afraid to bring in resources as full-time employees from overseas to work for them that have that background. That's kind of what good looks like. What bad looks like is just do nothing and put your head in the sand and say, we're too small to get hit. That's what we see a lot of as well. Or I've even had a lot of companies say, if we invest in cyber and it's in some way public that we've invested in cyber, it makes us a bigger target, which is nonsense. It's just complete nonsense. Yeah, you remember that the financial, so financial organizations, they know how to deal with fraud and extortion, and they've been through it for before cyber began. Anti-money laundering, KYC sanctions, all of these things, strong compliance, strong risk teams. So they've got it anyway, whereas the others are starting from scratch, and they have employed and have proper chief security officer, chief information security officers. In a lot of the others that are doing it wrong, it's really like, Mr. Suzuki's close to retirement, let's make him chief security officer, and sure, if anything happens, we can just fire him. And we can say, but we had a chief security officer, and you know what? We've had a problem, so we fired him. So please forgive us. And unfortunately, when I talk to Mr. Suzuki, I know within 3 seconds that he has no understanding of cyber or security or the defense of his company.
Does leadership at the top make a lot of difference, or is it more a matter of having technical specialists at the working level who know what they're doing?
Yeah, so cyber's a board. It's a board discussion these days. If you're not having a board meeting as a listed Japanese company, and if cyber's not tabled in your board meeting, there's something wrong. There's nothing wrong. Because the biggest risk to any corporation today is cyber, I feel, in that sense.
Hey, good morning. Kenji Govars, Bain Company. Got 2 questions. First, regarding the private sector. Second, regarding the public sector. So private sector is understand about the gap in resources. 250,000 people are needed in Japan, maybe more. But even if we train 2,000 people a year from now, it's going to take like 50 years to get there anyway. So probably it's going to be only part of the solution. My question is, do these people have to be in Japan actually? With everything going on around the world, with everything being done remote, servers being located everywhere or whatever it is, including maybe the Toyota servers in China or in Latin America, wherever they are. Do we have to believe that all these resources have to be based in Japan? Because otherwise, I feel like we're not going to get there. So that was question number 1. Question number 2 is on the public sector. And again, assuming that we're not getting there, we have a huge gap. Is there in your mind a grand deal with the US saying, well, we're going to be under your cyber security umbrella from now on? We're going to buy you more F-35, more destroyers. We can buy everything, any hardware you want us to buy, but we're going to be under your umbrella because it's the only way actually we can get this done.
So, yes, you can use resources from overseas, but you have to be building your own capability locally. You have to. If you want to believe that the future of your country depends on the resources that you bring from overseas, there's a big risk to that. And one would only have to have looked at what potentially could happen in an election in the United States were it to go a certain way or a certain new president come into power, that, Yokosuka might disappear. The troops might be pulled out of South Korea and Japan, and then they say, well, actually, we don't want to support your cyber protection any longer because it's a confrontational issue with our friends, which may become China in the future. So are you going to take that risk? You have to be building national capability yourself, but use your friends and collaborate with your friends for as long as it takes until you have that capability. And the US and the UK and other Five Eyes nations are only too happy to support Japan in that journey. But they really want Japan to start that journey. We see things like that new GCAD fighter program between the UK and Italy and Japan to build next generation fighter. Well, therein lies a huge target for nation states to attack that program. And there is a worry about, as I highlighted, clearances and these kind of things. But you have to be building national capability. And remember, it's very easy to infiltrate an overseas branch or personnel in an overseas, much easier than it is to infiltrate locally in Japan itself.
It's actually interesting. We were involved at the periphery of, 5 years ago, one of the high-flying American cybersecurity leaders, right, in potentially doing a joint venture with one of the big Japanese conglomerates, right? And the board rejected it in the end, for exactly that reason, that, no, we're going to do this ourselves. To which we, of course, said, well, if you start today, you'll be where we are today in about 5 years, and we will be, further ahead there. But it's quite interesting that, at least in this particular instance, this awareness of, having to do it on your own, right? At least in some of the Japanese conglomerates is very, very high.
We have a few questions from cyberspace. This question comes from Chris Capper at the British Embassy, Tokyo. He says, Cartan, many thanks for your brief today. Given Japan's comparatively small cyber force, what sort of technology do you think Japan needs to develop to augment and automate their existing capabilities? Can you give us kind of specific?
From a government perspective, I would look at some of those programs. Unfortunately, I know the UK better than I know other countries' programs. But within the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, they have two technologies. One is Netcraft, which is an automated takedown service for malicious sites and phishing campaigns. They do that automatically for everyone in the UK. And then on the public sector side of the UK, they have another technology from a company called Nominet, which is a protective DNS service that they do as well. So, for example, when SolarWinds hit, I hope I got these numbers right. SolarWinds hit the UK government because they had this PDNS service in the entire public sector protecting emergency service, hospitals, all the government. They knew the exposure for SolarWinds within 4 hours. And it took other countries 6 months. So there are some technologies that are used at a national level that are very good for that.
So that's like for a layman, that's like an early warning system.
Yes, Netcraft is for the takedowns of sites, and PDNS is a protective service against the public sector. So those are the kind of things that you could do at a national level that would have a great impact. And the United States have similar programs as well, and implementing more of that at a national level as well, because that does eliminate the need for thousands of resources to defend the public sector.
Right. So we have another question that's kind of a follow-on of that. And so what, you had just mentioned a few technologies there, but what are the vulnerabilities of the Japanese MSPs that you mentioned earlier?
So look at the size of the footprint, of Fujitsu, Hitachi, NEC, NTT. They're huge. And we, their estate in terms of their infrastructure is so huge that it brings with it huge vulnerabilities in different areas. And trying to catch all of that for those mega corporations is very, very difficult. And one would only have to look at the mergers and acquisitions that take place in those huge conglomerates of the bank company here, company there. What are they bringing into that infrastructure? Then they've got a global footprint. Is the guy in Brussels, is he doing his job to protect NTT? They probably have very good protections at the head office level, but it's very, very difficult for them. And of course, they're a huge target because they manage so much personal information of so many people in so many different areas that it's a huge attractive target, especially for any nation state side of things. I mean, I don't want to alarm anyone in this room, but of course I've got my number card, and I thought this is a great idea, national ID card and everything. Oh, okay, I signed up for the my number card, and then I logged in, and I could see my health insurance records, my pensions records, my tax records, even the medicines that I had taken in my past history as well. And I was like, I didn't know it would store all of this in online. What a target that is for anyone to steal that kind of data.
So you changed your password?
Well, here's the interesting thing about passwords and things. So it's a card. As long as you've got a card or a copy of the card, and this is where this whole NFC tags and all of these kind of things, to be able to copy these or steal these cards. 4-number PIN. 4-number PIN. So you DDoS attack or if you want to blast a network with passwords, well, you only need up to 9,999 because only 4 digits. Right. And the data in there. So you could imagine, had you been in some business trip and you'd been a bad boy and something had happened, you'd been to your local doctor and got some medicine for something, and well, there it is. And that's the information that if you get a telephone call, dear Mr. X, I have this information about you. I shall publish it. So these things, digitalization's a great thing, but it makes the target. But what do you do? Do you remain analog or do you remain paper-based? What do you do? And 5G as well, and IoTs, and we're rushing ahead into this world, and AI and chat GPT, and we're giving more vulnerabilities. We're opening the door to more and more vulnerabilities for ourselves in society, and where will it end? And where's the global policy to protect everyone from not using these things against us? Because it destroys lives, it destroys companies, and this is, all the stuff I'm talking about Ukraine and war and everything, but they're human beings, and people affected badly by this. And I'm sitting there, and often I get called in to do the crisis side of things, and I see the CEO, and he's built a company for 30 years. He's given up his weekends, his holidays, and everything to build this wonderful company. And he's in a corner. He doesn't have the money to pay the ransom. He knows that if the data that has been taken is published, that it will be the end of his corporation. Well, it's just not fair. It's just not fair, and that jurisdictionally that they can just, take advantage of us like that, and that the governing bodies in Russia and in China let this go on.
So I have 2 more questions.
Sure.
First question is, everyone seems to agree that Japan is far behind. Every discussion, everything I've read. Okay, there does seem to be a difference of views about whether Japan is falling behind or is catching up. And there are some people who have this kind of optimistic view that because the defense budget is going to be doubled in 5 years, there's going to be a real emphasis on cybersecurity, and that Japan will eventually catch up. Then there are those who say, the mindset, the organization, bureaucracy, all that is going to impede Japan. So Japan is actually going to fall behind. So which of these 2 views do you subscribe to, and what is the evidence, number 1? Number 2, if the Japanese government were to ask you, and they may have already asked you, what should they do about TikTok? What would be your answer?
So I think Japan will catch up. I think there are some very good signs. That defense budget thing, I don't see that as an indicator of how Japan will catch up, but I do see signs. I do see consolidation. The digital agency was formed. I could see even the government websites. Those are good signs that there's a realization that change is upon us. I think NISC, we will see changes there as well. I think the Japanese intelligence community and indeed Boisho itself realise that so change is coming. I think it will speed up. I think we'll see an increased number of attacks, and that will drive change more than anything else as well. But they will catch up. They will catch up because the alternative is not pretty. So I think, and remember that, you know, the UK suffered great pain too before they made these changes that affected a great increase in cyber awareness and policy and yeah. So you know, behind but catching up, I would think. Yeah. TikTok, gosh, I'd pull it down.
I always thought that the you know, first of all, I mean, Glenn, as you know extremely well, you know, sort of Japan is excellent at catching up. You know, studying, and you know, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you know, over the last 3 years, Sono Kanshin, you know, the awareness and sending out study groups at all these different parts of the government, right? It's always, you know, very, very diverse, right? But actually being able to pull it together, you know, when push comes to shove, they are ultimately very good. And I was very, I mean, yes, of course you're scaring us, but, you know, I was very, and I take this to heart, you know, that, you know, the public utilities infrastructure, for example, you know, is actually world class in terms of the protection that you have, right? So that's good. So fine, there's lots of, you know, small and medium-sized companies, you know, who are run by 72-year-olds who've never used a smartphone. You know, we get all of that, right? But, you know, let's not, you know, I mean, Japan is behind. Of course, Japan is behind. That's its business, right? But again, there are some very strong strongholds, right, where Japan has done an excellent job.
Yeah, yeah.
And on the TikTok side, I think that it's very simple. I think you should have the entire cabinet just doing a cool dance routine and everything's fine. Sorry, I'm being facetious.
Well, just shifting gears, it's regards to Russian cyber operation against Ukraine. So the Russian cyber operations against Ukraine targets have been significantly less than many expected. What do you think about that?
If you go, you need to go back to the Crimean operation, which is a very, very sophisticated cyber warfare that took place, and that was a very, very successful operation, and cyber was used extensively in that, very successfully. Putin thought that he could capture Ukraine much more quickly using just kinetic means. It wasn't properly planned. We saw the detonation and the creation of more malware that was used to destroy rather than being used as information tactics being used there. There was also that engagement and the lessons learned from 2014 that Ukraine had built up capability of its own, or indeed been supported in the capability of its own by other nations to defend it against those operations and tactics that had been used in Crimea. So that was a change. So it became more destructive rather than hybrid warfare, where it's a combination of kinetic and cyber together, and Putin envisaged just the kinetic side more than the cyber side. And once the operation started, it was too late.
So do you think those are those are kind of the lessons that other countries should learn?
Well, so the Russians will learn from it. and so will the Chinese. They'll learn from it too, what not to do. And they learned, indeed, the whole world learned from what the Russians did in Crimea of how successful it was. So in Taiwan today, influence operations and from that side of things, information warfare is ongoing, and the PLA are using Taiwan as a test bed of what they will eventually use that capability for against the rest of the world in what it does, and TikTok being part of that too.
Cartan, let me sort of ask one specific question. Quad, Japan, America, Australia, India. Number one, can you elaborate a little bit to your knowledge whether cybersecurity is on the agenda and how it is being implemented? And then as a follow-on on that, India. India, in the private sector, is run by very capable Indian engineers. I think you're 70% of the startups from Silicon Valley, over the last, I forget, 5-6 years, the CEOs are Indian, typically with an engineering background there. Can you elaborate a little bit on India and, on Quad?
So Quad was the brainchild of Prime Minister Abe, may he rest in peace, and I think it was a very, very smart move. India now's population outstrips that of China. It's what you would refer to as the fourth front of the back door of China, and China is keenly aware of that fact. So it's a very smart move, the Quad. Yes, India has very capable engineers, very capable computer scientists, education system that supports all of it. Cyber, pretty new.
Pretty new
in India. Yeah. Although, if you were to read and believe everything in some of the newspapers at the minute, I think quite a few corporate intelligence agencies in the UK were using Indian hackers for their own means. But I have an office in Delhi. I have 10 full-time staff, some very good young Indian engineers who again, I'm cross-training in cyber as well. A great place to recruit from. And you're right, many of the Silicon Valley guys are Indian chaps as well. Yes, if you were to pick somewhere where you would go for engineers, where there's a surplus, you would go to India. It has alignment. I know that the current Indian government has a relationship with Russia and that kind of thing, but that's kind of a historical thing. I think that eventually, Rishi Sunak is the Prime Minister of the UK, and there's a strong relationship between India and the UK and other nations in the region. And remember that we have all these border skirmishes going on between India and China all the time, anyway, and land grabs going on there. So the Quad is very strategic, very strategic in that sense.
Right. Thank you, Terry.
So breaking news just has come out. Microsoft says China installed malware in U.S. systems in Guam. The National Security Agency and Microsoft have revealed that the alleged state-sponsored Chinese hacking group Volt Typhoon installed surveillance malware in critical systems on the island of Guam and elsewhere in the U.S.
Yeah.
So I raise this breaking news, very timely for our event, because this is exactly the kind of announcement that is needed to spur action in Japan. The problem that I've witnessed going back quite a few years with regard to cyber use of the internet is that all the problems are hidden underneath the carpet. Then when they come up above the carpet, then all of a sudden action has to be taken. This is a great alarm bell, because if they're doing it in Guam, they're certainly doing it elsewhere. And why are they doing it there? Because the U.S. plans to increase the capabilities that will come out of Guam vis-a-vis China. The flip side of it, though, is I certainly saw this with anti-money laundering. The worst violations of anti-money laundering, other than HSBC, which actually moved plane loads of cash from Mexico to the United States, you still have to think about that, were the Japanese banks, the worst. And they only acted when the United States fined them for all the violations. But the flip side of that is that they then became draconian, so that, an honest citizen, couldn't have an account anymore at a Japanese bank. So we will get action, I'm quite confident, because there'll be more announcements like this situation in Guam.
Yeah, so, if you can infiltrate the US government and the UK government, what does that mean for here in terms of their networks and with the staging and Snowden, he's not a whistleblower, he was a traitor. I'm sorry, I have very strong views on Snowden. But yes, that staging capability, you can be sure, has taken place in infrastructure in Japan as well. Staging. So
good. I want to thank you. You've scared us, which we knew you were going to do. But it's interesting because, like many of these things, but I think, cyber clearly being at the frontier, the sort of classic Japanese rigidities, right? The fragmentation of the government, the social inertia because of historic legacies, historic aversions. The reality of, yes, there is an inflection point, and Minister Aso, well, he's no longer minister, Aso Sensei, may very well be right that it was the flip, the end of Heisei and the start of Reisei, not Reisei, the end of Heiwa and the start of Reiwa. Now I've got it completely.
Heisei to
Reiwa. I'm sorry. What? Showa. Yes, you and I. Showa. 5 years ago, obviously some inflection happened here. Japan is alert. Japan is aware. Will it take a big crisis? Will it take a sequence of crises to really focus the mind and actually produce action? We shall see. But I want to thank you, Cartan, for laying out the problem. And I do hope that the digital minister has your ear and that the My Number Card PIN code is going to be changed and security tightened up a little bit. Thank you very much. Thank you, Cartan.